welcome to our Trust Your Supplier podcast, where we discuss everything supplier engagement and life cycle management. We want to provide you with as much information on how comprehensive risk monitoring, regulatory compliance, data credibility, technology, real-time access of information will nurture the success of your supply chain. Today's subject is relevant for all our listeners and actually very exciting for all of us to understand and to experience today. We explore the intersection of global politics, economics, and supply chains. In today's fast-paced world, understanding the dynamics of international trade is crucial. And we're here to dive into geopolitical events, economic policies, environmental challenges, and how all of these impact the global flow of goods and services. We are joined today with Johan and George from Prism, the first political and only geopolitical risk analysis firm specializing in procurement and supply chain. A really large statement that we'll get into in a minute. I'd first like to introduce myself. My name is Michelle Armstrong. I am the Vice President of Value Engineering at Trust Your Supplier, and I'm welcoming my colleague, Chad, who is our Chief Revenue Officer as well. So, Johan and George, thank you very much for joining us today. In a world full of economic crisis, this is a great subject matter that all of us are extremely interested in. Before we actually go into any of our conversation, the statement, "You are the first political and only geopolitical risk analysis," is a huge statement to make, and one that I personally don't really understand. So could you tell us a little bit more about your own background, Prism, and why you feel you're able to justify such a bold statement?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think for supply chain and procurement used to develop, and the supply chains we see today developed in a very different world where we were in a period of relative peace, increasing openness. People talk about globalization and trade barriers were just, coming down more and more for every year that went. It became easier and easier to operate globally, and so people did, and they built extremely complicated and very efficient global supply chains. Very good from an economics perspective. But now that's not quite the world we live in anymore. Now we see conflict, we see trade wars, we see very volatile economics. I mean, completely even disregarding everything that happened during the pandemic, but everything else, much more man-made, is getting more and more difficult and complicated. And so in this industry, political risk, that was built for a different set of audiences traditionally. Either it was bankers who did cross-transactional deals and just needed to sort of work with the politics and make sure that they hit the right moments, or maybe it was even market entry. As you increased your company's footprint, you just wanted to know which country was better than another. But nobody was really thinking about the need of securing your supply chain for geopolitical and macro risks. And so 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, when we started talking about this company, George and I really saw this big gap in the market where supply chain professionals needed this kind of advice more than ever. But at the same time, the market wasn't providing it. The market was providing information that was really designed for a very different audience, whether that be Davos, whether that be hedge fund managers, or whether that be sort of market entry folks, but not for the procurement and supply chain. They were sort of left in the dark.
So you're from the Nordics here in Europe, and George, I know, is definitely from the United Kingdom with his beautiful accent. Why does Prism's head office be in Washington?
We're very much a global company. We have clients both in Europe and in the United States. And so it could have been anywhere in that sense. It is just, I think Washington is not just the seat of the US government, which of course makes it a very unique place, but it is also a place of a lot of various institutions, etc., that does global work, whether that be the World Bank that does development work all around the world, or the IMF, whether that be think tanks. There's, of course, a lot of different companies here as well. But in terms of global analysis, Washington is definitely one of the leading places. It's an easy place to find talent. There's a lot of great universities for international economics, international relations here. So it's a great place. Great place to be.
And being interesting, George, can you give us a little bit of history as to how you and Johan actually fell into this? I think that's, to me, it's just really understanding, and I'm sure my audience as well, understanding the business case behind Prism itself.
Yeah, no, I mean, our origin story goes back even further than Johan said. I think he talked about 5 years ago when we first started talking about this. But actually, when we first started working together on this, was during our time at Carney, one of the larger procurement and supply chain consulting firms, in around 2015-ish. And that timing, I think, is not not unimportant, because that is around the time that Donald Trump was first running. Brexit campaign was starting, and that coincided or kicked off a wave of corporate interest in this sort of issue. And so myself and Johan started working together on that in the context of Carney, and trying to deliver strategic advice on those issues, in particular about the pending trade war at the time, which under Trump's first administration was about NAFTA as well as China. And the NAFTA element of it saw a deal ultimately, and the China element of it saw what we've all experienced over the last several years since then. So that was really the origin story. And I think what we experienced working together then was exactly what Johan said at the beginning, which is that there's a real missing piece here for applied geopolitical analysis for procurement and supply chain. And after that time working together, I went to Eurasia Group. You asked at the beginning, Michelle, are we the first and only procurement supply chain geopolitics firm? Eurasia Group is the very first major geopolitics corporate advisory firm in total. But my experience there, I think, was aligned to what Johan said at the beginning. There's a market here for a different audience of procurement supply chain, where we can tailor analysis to help them make their specific decisions and the specific challenges that this creates for them. And I think the combination of those two experiences were why we felt that there was a business case for us to start our own company doing this. Mixing those two things, and by that I mean applied approaches to helping clients with these problems, but through a specialist geopolitics lens.
Who is the person that you would speak to in an organization, and why does it matter for them from a supply chain and procurement perspective?
Great question. So I think we operate with audiences across the different levels in procurement and supply chain organizations, all the way from the CPO down to category managers and other operational leaders. So it's quite broad in that sense. And in fact, we've actually found ourselves to be useful for procurement organizations beyond their own function, i.e. often our insights will be sent from procurement leaders to their counterparts across the organization in a way that can help share information across a company. And the reason that it's happens to be broad is you might think that what we do is a sort of CPO, C-level executive thing only. But one of the main things that we were founded, or we exist on the basis of, is to try and make this tangible and help people understand why this really matters in their day-to-day decisions. At a tactical level, we think about that in three categories mainly. One is cost, two is disruption, and three is reputation. And I think the macro challenges that we're seeing today are more important than they've ever been for all of those three categories. If you think about the cost side of things, we have a period of historic inflation that is still ongoing, is not quite down to where policymakers would like it to be. That's affecting, or has affected, and is still affecting almost every person, from the CPO down into the person leading the buying decisions on one single contract, for instance. Johan talked about trade wars, which has a direct tariff impact on the cost of importing a good from one country to another. On the supply disruption side, We have wars, obviously, that's been massively important. We have sanctions, we have natural disasters. We just saw an earthquake in Taiwan last week. There was also one in New York, actually, where I am, but that was less supply chain impactful. And then on the reputation side, this is an increasingly geopolitical issue too. With ESG obviously being so high on the agenda there, but everything from emissions to human rights to deforestation now are all part of the political machine alongside the strategic decision-making machine, and that's why we have to cover those things too.
If I speak to some of our audiences, they would say, well, doesn't my aggregator provider provide, anti-bribery, anti-corruption and sanctions information, PEPs information? Doesn't my sustainability provider provide my ESG information, and somebody else provides my financial stability? Explain to me why, or explain to the audience why you are different to the normal third-party provider that they would use within their supply chain.
I mean, I think that very much talks to the exact need that we are filling, that especially what you just described, there's always somebody else doing it, right? And they're doing a piecemeal of it. And they do it often in a very tactical way. Compliance is incredibly important, but it just, here's the rules and here's what we're doing, all right? For example, financial planning, very much the same. But what we're trying to do is to, first of all, give the leaders a holistic view of the different risks that are happening, and also a forward-looking view in terms of not just what happened yesterday that we need to firefight around, but what might happen in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months that we can already now start proactively to plan around, to have the compliance folks not be surprised, or the financial the finance people not having to firefight around. That problems have already been, if not resolved, at least minimized in terms of the type of impact it could be on the company. So that's really what I think we're here to do.
The probing question is a useful one to help us get to some of the points about why we exist, and I think in a sharper way, because I think you're absolutely right about all of the solutions that exist out there at the moment for various different parts of this. All of those have existed for quite some time, and yet when Russia invades Ukraine, everybody is taken by surprise. This isn't showing up in anybody's risk system, and I think Johan was for good reason carefully avoiding the word forecast, because that's a dangerous word. Predictions are a dangerous word, but there is no solution that focuses on the macro side of things in the way that we do, that is looking out for those things on a forward-looking basis. Again, not making predictions per se about this is going to happen with this level of certainty, but saying that this is a problem that is building up. You now have the opportunity to move early. The example with Russia-Ukraine being the troops are building up on the border. This has become a high probability event over the next several months, and no longer wait until after it's happened and you're reactive. You're doing things at exactly the same time as all of your competitors. So when you're shifting supply, they're shifting supply, which leads to shortages or at least price increases because there's excess demand. The preparation time that we give, I think, is crucial.
What are the emerging trends in global politics and economics? What should our buyers or our customers be aware of, in the next, 6 months, with so many elections happening, all the way out to the next, 18, 3 years?
Yeah, and I have a couple of points here around geopolitics that I think are the ones to put on the board here, and I know George has a couple of others. But for me, looking at the geopolitical situation, 3 very large things that loom large. One is the US election. We believe that is the largest risk event of 2024. Not to be overly US-centric here, and the US election takes up way more oxygen in the global newsfeed than it should for any other country, and indeed also for the US. It goes on for a long time. And also, there's a lot of political opinions here, of course, but what we really zone in on is both Biden and Trump, to a certain degree, are more focused on government intervention in the economy than their predecessors. But the real thing here is the Trump trade policy, which could be highly disruptive. It was, George already referenced, back in 2016, 2018, those trade actions. We believe for very good reason that we're going to see another round of trade wars happening if Trump gets elected this time. That is an immediate and direct cost increase for anybody who's trading between US and China, whether you import or export, just in straight up tariffs. So that's super important to track. The other one, of course, China in so many ways. And the reason China is so important, of course, is because over the years, so much global production have ended up in China. It is one of the indispensable countries in almost every supply chain, and everything that happens in China has huge impact. We saw that during the pandemic lockdowns, for example, how important China was, and I don't think anybody needs really a reminder of that. And there's a lot of things going on in China, of course, but we see even there what happens economically in terms of the type of stimulus that's been given, focused on more supply is going to lead to more tensions from a trading perspective with the rest of the world. And then largely just the amount of conflict that we're seeing in the world is steadily increasing. The type of military conflict that we were unused to seeing in the last, say, 20 years, the kind of things we see between Russia and Ukraine, for example, and also what we now see in Israel and Gaza and the kind of military conflict that's happening. And there's plenty of other hotspots brewing as well that could burst out in military conflict. So those things I really want to put on people's radar to be tracking.
And how can you assist them with that radar? What can you do to give that information to them?
So a number of things. I mean, in terms of what we do at Prism, we do, I mean, broadly 3 different things to help companies. One is to monitor and track what's happening. So we're tracking the various different developments. We know what these hotspots are. We track them every month. We see where they're going. At the same time, we're also scanning for new emerging things that might not be a thing. For example, George mentioned Russia and Ukraine. Of course, there was conflict between Russia and Ukraine way before this current large-scale invasion, but very few people foresaw that kind of massive invasion, say, a year or 2 years ago. So that's something you need to sort of have your tentacles out for and see what the signs are for a significant escalation, for example. The second one is just translation to help turn the immense flood of news from that immense flood to something very concrete. And these are the top risks from a supply chain perspective, not from a news organization sort of audience prioritization perspective, as well as the sort of impacts that we have there. And just to change that flood of very difficult to assert noise from the news to signal in terms of what's real and what's not. And then finally, prepare, give the early warning. We run war games or crisis simulations with companies. We suggest mitigation actions as these conflicts as these risks become more and more concrete.
And before we leave these emerging trends, I'm interested because you mentioned that the effects of a Trump presidency on the supply chain and how that could lead to possible trade wars. If we have 4 more years of a Biden presidency, how do you see the effects panning out there over the next 4 years?
Yeah, so from a Biden perspective, I mean, I think what's interesting about Trump and Biden, if you compare them, is that, again, both of them have much more government intervention instincts than any of Obama, Bush, or Clinton, or even, Bush before that, or not to mention Ronald Reagan. So it's a big shift here, a generational shift, I would say, in politics. And so the Trump government intervention when it comes to supply chains really manifests itself in trade. Is one of Trump's. I mean, in many ways, Trump is ideologically not that committed always, but there's a couple of topics. There is a very consistent view and a deeply held belief, and one of them is trade, and how other countries are taking advantage of America. America is getting a bad deal. It is bad for the American people with this kind of free trade. And really trying to reduce that, or at least make it a fair deal, has been his major thing. So we have saw that in the US-China trade war starting in 2018. And then also notably continued under Joe Biden. Joe Biden did not repeal these tariffs. So what Trump started is being continued by Joe Biden. So that's number one, I think, on Biden. He might not have done this himself, but when policy is in place, did not see fit to remove it. So that's, I think, is topic number one. Might not be as radical as Trump, but did maintain those trade policies. And point number two with Biden, of course, is the massive spending on industrial development in America, focusing on semiconductor production, to localize semiconductor production in America, and spending billions of dollars building chip factories. Same with renewable energy, spending billions of dollars in support for American companies building this. And the European Union, for example, have protested that the rules here are protectionist, in that they are supporting American companies versus European. So there's a certain element of protectionism there as well. But I think the risk here from a supply chain is somewhat more limited. I think the biggest risk with that kind of government spending on certain industries is the government is infamously bad at picking winners. Often it ends up wasting billions of dollars on producing things in countries that might not be optimal, or focusing technologies that in 10 years are already obsolete, etc. It's a high risk that these policies are not so effective. But again, from a supply chain perspective, not as disruptive as tariffs, which has that sort of straight one-to-one. You raise tariff by 10%, your costs are definitely going up by exactly 10%.
One that I keep talking about or hearing about as well is, artificial intelligence. Everybody's talking about it. It's buzzwords at the moment. There's no doubt about it. The race to innovate and regulate AI, it seems to be very, central and dynamic in the US-China relations. Do you see that as something that we should be concerned about or worried about from, a geopolitical perspective?
I think from a strategic perspective, geopolitically, yes, it's very, very important. It's seen as the technology of the future, and therefore important from a economic competitiveness standpoint to win, as it were, or to be in the lead. But also from a defense perspective, given the potential defense applications of AI, it's also seen as even more important than just pure economic competitiveness. So that's why there is these billions and billions of dollars being spent on semiconductors that Johan mentioned, for example, because that's one of the key inputs to successful AI model development, and therefore we have to have security of supply, at least from a national security perspective. So I think there is subcomponents of it that are important in the near term for that reason, from a supply chain perspective, because I think it will drive a lot of changes in production locations for things that are related to AI, and that is semiconductor factories, but it's also semiconductor fabs, but it's also data centers, it's also grid upgrades to enable the electricity supply to the data centers, for example. So there will be a lot of government spending, and it's not just in the US. We're seeing Japan, the UK, India, France. Everybody has a massive, in the tens of billions of dollars, government spending program to localize production. So we are going to see a lot of production ramp up in lots of different countries. I think from a supply chain perspective, more narrowly though, I would say there's a different story depending on the time horizon. I think in the immediate term, it feels to me as though AI creates more risks than it has rewards in the immediate term, because there's all sorts of ESG challenges at the moment. The water usage, the energy usage is enormous. And so that's going to affect your ESG footprint if you're using different AI models, for example, or at least needs to be assessed. There is going to be spikes in demand, as we've already seen for specific advanced types of semiconductors. That could be a problem. There's people already worried about electricity outages. There's a lot of risks that comes from this boom, purely from a narrow supply chain perspective, that I think aren't yet outweighed by the benefits of applying AI in your supply chain functions to, for example, get efficiencies. I think that balance will start to change over the medium term when you start to see real reward from some of the deployment of AI that we're seeing in procurement and supply chain, whether that's through category strategies, risk monitoring, for example. There's so many different applications that everybody's already working on, but those are probably more medium-term payoffs, and we'll start to see that I would think a couple of years or longer. And then in the long term, it's much more transformative, which is obviously what everybody is more interested and worried about from a societal perspective. But the analogy that we like to make is with smartphones, and the smartphone. I think the iPhone came out in 2008, and I believe the BlackBerry was still the #1 phone in 2010. And it took a long time for the smartphone to have the level of impacts that it had. And I think we're going to see something similar. We've got a number of years before this becomes transformative in the way that people are talking about. But all that said, I think everyone is already working on these things now. And that has to happen, because in order to get some of those longer term payoffs, you need to be working on it now.
So I'll take that to the next step then, because for us, everybody asks, do you have AI? Or do you have AI? And I always talk about, well, it's not just about having an AI, it has to have a true value as well. You know, and what's that long-term value before you go off and try and build something? So you're completely right. How do you track those issues? And, you know, how do these and those indicators that you're tracking really predict potential risks or opportunities for your customers?
I mean, on AI specifically, and I guess this applies for how we do everything, but we do like to break it down into those tangible impacts. And so I think we shy away from looking at those longer term sort of societal existential risk problems that a lot of people like to talk about in the Davos world, and generally is the focus of the questions in our field. And get it down to a focus on the more immediate things that you need to be doing to prepare. A few examples of those specifically in AI, we do track where there are spikes in demand. For example, we have a semiconductor index specifically that tracks demand for different types of semiconductors. We do have reporting and tracking of different use cases that are being used by procurement supply chain teams of AI. Those things get reported out, and it's good inspiration to see how other people are using it and stay on top of it, also stay at the leading edge. And then we do follow the regulation, which you already mentioned, and we do follow that very closely for a variety of reasons, because we have one of which being we have a large number of tech clients. I think the interesting thing to note there, though, is one of the most important things in AI regulation to be tracking for most procurement supply chain leaders is how AI applies to existing regulation, as opposed to what the implications of the new EU AI Act is, for example. Most companies are not going to see the most important restraints or risks arise from regulation that is primarily targeted at very advanced use cases or the models themselves. It's going to be things like misusing your data under existing privacy regulations. And so it's both things that you need to be tracking from a regulatory perspective.
And I think that's what makes me quite nervous. And I think, you know, anybody who's watching this, it's, you know, today's compliance regulations, you know, for AI, to be honest, are very ambiguous. You know, it's still open because they don't really know where AI is going to go. There's no borders with AI. As we all know, it's something that we're always talking about from a geopolitical perspective. It's how you're managing that. When do you go to the likes of a customer to explain that to them, to go, before you go off and source, before you go off and purchase a product, etc.? Where's your input to that first point of contact into a customer?
Unfortunately, often when our starting point with customers is when a geopolitical event has just hammered them that they weren't prepared for. And we get a call largely on the premise of, make sure this never happens again. So that's often the entry point. But I think from the more tactically, I think in terms of how our information can feed into different processes, there's a variety of different ways, because our stuff can be used at different parts of specific processes, like supplier onboarding, for instance. And You want to check the risk exposure of the supplier's country, for example. It can be we have a whole thing around annual strategy, where you're developing your strategy for the next year and you want to understand the macro risks that are relevant for your category. So we do that as well. So we have several entry points, but at the larger, higher level, I think the biggest or most common trigger, unfortunately, is when you've already been hurt.
And Johan, do you have something on that side to say?
No, I mean, I think that's largely correct. Sometimes, luckily, it's before people get hurt. For example, when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, as the Speaker of the House in the United States at the time, triggered a very angry response from China with a lot of military exercises off the coast. That didn't hurt anybody from a supply chain perspective, but it definitely spiked people's interest. We got a lot of questions and requests coming out of that one, for example. So there is also those sort of reminders, if you will. Then I think a second way to think about this is also there is now a sort of new generation, I think, of procurement and supply chain leaders that are highly transformational in nature, to think about transforming their business in many ways. So one is obviously technology, which I'm sure TYS is very well familiar with, but it's also becoming more of a value center in the company procurement. I mean, I think most people listening to this podcast well aware of a procurement has been seen as a cost center, but there is tremendous value to be had there. And one of those things that you can add value is to early on have this function and not, again, let other people in finance, in compliance, and risk management sort of, do the work for you, but starting to proactively take that work and saving money ahead of time, or at least avoiding costs, as well as
tactical sourcing. I suppose that's tactical sourcing, isn't it? It's making sure you know what you're doing.
That's
right. At the very beginning.
And then also, George mentioned, bring it to other parts of the business. Hey, we are tracking this. Are you tracking this? To sort of be part of that conversation around the table and be a meaningful counterpart, I think is another very important driver for people to reach out to us.
I think that's really important because I think you and I both work with audiences that have moved away from the word a procurement team to a sourcing team, because they recognize that there is a huge potential of understanding what geopolitical, in conjunction with compliance and regulatory activities, they need to combine really to make those understandings. And one of those combinations is, of course, as you've mentioned, climate change, and ESG. How do you feel that is impacting us from a geopolitical and tactical sourcing perspective?
Great question. Similar to the AI stream, where just ESG is one of the most fundamentally important trends and most impactful trends of procurement supply chain of our time, I think. Geopolitically, it's a really interesting moment, politically, domestically, in lots of different countries as well. In particular, because this is a big election year globally, and so historically we've often seen rising backlash against, in particular, climate policy in election periods in various different countries in the past. It looks to be no different this year. So the trend, at least at the very macro level, that we see is some level of backlash against ESG writ large. But from our perspective, and I think the thing that we think is most important to disaggregate is how that is affecting different parts of ESG, because it looks different in the E versus the S versus the G, for example. And I think in the E side of things, we are moving full steam ahead despite some hiccups. The biggest example that we see there is what's been happening in the EU. Obviously, that's the prime example for everything sustainability from a political perspective. And what we see right there now is the impact of the elections already being felt, because there are delays in implementation in various different rules. We saw really just limping over the line some of the most landmark regulations, like the CSDDD, for example. The Deforestation Act looks like it might be watered down a little bit. The CBAM had some problems in its initial compliance reporting period. We're really starting to see some hiccups, and with farmer protests in Europe, that some of the other parts of climate regulation might be watered down. For example, nature restoration law, agricultural rules. There is a lot of stuff going on there, but it is limping over the line, and it is our expectation that things are going to continue to ramp up on the environmental side of things. Once all of these laws are passed, we get into a new EU term, and regardless of the growth in power of right-wing parties in the European Parliament that we do expect, so many of these laws will have passed by then, that it's going to become a compliance issue, and that will run its course in an accelerating way as we get more transparency from disclosure laws, and that is the rules target other countries as well, who then have to create their own laws in order to keep up or not have their exporters be harmed. So we think that's going to move along rapidly, and it's important not to get distracted by some of the political noise that is happening already and will happen this year. The S and the G side of things is more complicated, because there is definitely legitimately some backlash, for example, especially in the US on DEI initiatives. You can expect that to be significantly ramped up if we get a Trump re-election, for example. And then there is some mixed signals, I think, on labor risk. We've seen the EU just pass their own forced labor ban, but that doesn't go into effect for a while, and they were pretty slow on that. So there are, I think, more mixed signals in the S and the G. It's a bit more fragmented and a bit more complex versus the E, where we think it's mostly noise, some of the changes that we've seen lately.
I'm sure you've seen today there was a landmark case in Europe where Swiss women actually won a huge human rights case. Basically, they were saying the Swiss government had violated the human rights of its citizens by failing to do enough to combat climate change. And I've already been reading some articles about that today, and they have said that it is going to, embody more communities to bring climate chases against governments, and that they believe that many of the compliance laws in Europe are going to need to be ratified even just after this session, this court case today. How do you think things like that, now that individuals are taking countries to court with sustainability issues, how that may impact supply chain, etc.?
Yeah, fascinating. I think the litigation side of things is one of the most interesting areas to watch, because it has been growing for a while now. We've definitely seen a massive rise in climate litigation against companies that has increasingly been bearing fruit in terms of requiring payouts. It's really fantastic, and I think is another angle to change corporate behavior by creating financial penalties, or a new source of potential financial penalties for not taking this seriously enough. So I think that all adds to the broad perspective that we have, that whatever rollbacks or perceived pushback that you see on the climate side of things is mostly noise, because at the end of the day, we have a huge gap between planned net zero policies and the actual targets that we have all agreed to, even as countries. So at some point, firstly, we can't afford to even stall or pause on some of this stuff. And the actual direction of travel implies that we might see an even more sharp rise in action that needs to be taken by companies, as opposed to any leveling off. So I think this is just another example of why we should expect that.
So I'd love to round this up. I've got a couple of questions. I'd love either of you to really do a bit of an outreach to our clients, why they should come to you, what's the importance of doing it now, especially with elections, in November, which is going to happen pretty quickly. Why should they be coming to you now? What advantages is there of doing that? So if you could just give us that in a couple of sentences, it would be great.
Yeah, we're living in a world that's getting riskier day by day or month by month. The trend I was talking about earlier is definitely not letting up. And as these happens, they imply very large losses for companies. And often people say, well, nobody could have foreseen this. But in actuality, that's not correct. You can actually foresee this. Not at 100% certainty, but you do see a lot of probabilities increasing. And so now is the time, right? Now is the time to start preparing. And again, in many of these cases, there is ample time for preparation to be taken if you are tracking these topics, if you know that when the risks are rising, if you know when the event's happening, how they're going to unfold, and where you're going to be impacted. So that's definitely our pitch to companies.
I think that takes us back to what we talked about right at the very beginning, and why we've engaged with Prism from a trust your supplier perspective. You know, supplier engagement, life cycle management is extremely important. It's not just about getting that messages from you at the very beginning on sourcing events, etc. It's working with the likes of yourselves to go, how do you monitor that throughout the life cycle and the engagement that you have with those countries, those companies, etc. I'm really excited about our relationship with Prism. I'm really excited to understand a lot more. And if our audience hear any more, please do not hesitate to reach out either to Trust Your Supplier or Prism directly. George, Johan, I really appreciate this today. I definitely didn't know enough, so I'm really glad you've given us the insights.
Yeah, no, this was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.